So, welcome to the Awesome Marriage Podcast. We're so glad you're joining us here today. I'm your co host, Lindsay Few, and on the podcast with me is Dr. Kim Kimberling. We often say here at Awesome Marriage that conflict in marriage is inevitable, and it's how you handle it that matters most. But for some couples, that's not the case because there are some couples who don't really fight. So, today we're going to talk about what happens when conflict is never addressed and it just stays under the surface. And we're going to talk about conflict resolution for conflict avoiders. Make sure you stick around through the whole episode today because at the end, we'll be talking about some great resources to help you build into your marriage wherever you're at with the issue of conflict today. So, Dr. Kim, what is going to happen in a marriage where there is never any conflict?
Yeah, it's so hard to imagine that after 54 years of marriage that there would not be conflict because
Right.
we're different as husband and wife. We're different as man and woman. There's so many things that can cause conflict. So if a couple says we never fight, I would say they're probably never dealing with anything at all. They're just letting everything go, or they're not really being honest with me because conflict is, you look at Jesus' life, there's conflict all the way through Jesus' life. In so many different times and ways. Conflict is not bad in itself. It's how we handle conflict. And I think so many people have such a negative view of conflict. You say the word conflict and nobody gets warm, fuzzy thoughts. It's just like, oh no. And because I think most of us either never saw it modeled well, resolution, or never experienced that in our life at all. And so sometimes we avoid conflict, but I think it limits I think as hard as some of our conflicts have been over the years, we've grown through them, especially when you resolve a conflict together. It's like it's a victory. And I think it strengthens your marriage and draws you closer to each other. And so instead of avoiding conflict, it's like, how do we handle conflict in a way that's healthy? Because if you avoid it over time, it's probably just going to something's going to build up there. And then what happens then? When does it explode? Does somebody walk out the door and you think, I had no idea they were upset? What happens if you don't address the conflict? Because in this life, you're just going to have conflict in one way or the other.
Yeah. It's true. I mean, it sounds so, reductive to just throw it out there because I do think some people really don't want that to be true. But I think that the more you fear it, the less you're able to resolve it, right? So there are times when like you said, working through things, it's a victory. And you've also said that learning how to resolve conflict is a gift to your marriage because then you don't have to be afraid of it. You don't have to be afraid of bringing up issues, but you actually can be productive in resolving it. Is it going to be warm and fuzzy the whole way through? No, but it doesn't have to be this big disaster. It doesn't have to be an explosion.
Right.
So what we really want to see is we want couples to be equipped to not have to, tiptoe around things, but be able to address them in healthy ways, not the ways that you're afraid of, but ways that are actually productive.
Yeah, and I think if you said that, I was trying to think of for us, because we resolve conflict all the time now, but it's not I wouldn't see it as a negative. It's like when we've learned over time if something is bothering us, to share that with each other, and then we deal with it. And I think it's over time of respect, and we quit playing the games of who's got to win and all those kind of things, which we had to go through all that. And so I think it's, yes, we still have conflict, but we don't have destructive conflict, or haven't had destructive conflict in a long, long time. And some of that's experience, and some of it's the fact that we have worked on it and tried to keep short accounts. That's what we call it. If something bothers, you either decide, hey, I'm just going to let this go. It's not that big a deal. Or you talk about it, or you pray about it, or pray about it anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. That's good. I mean, that's a great distinction between conflict and destructive conflict. That's a great way to frame this. A lot of couples kind of have some conflict habits and patterns, but why is it that some couples are tending to avoid conflict altogether?
Well, I think for some, you kind of hit the fear of confrontation. We just don't know where it's going to go. We probably had some conflict that went bad in our lives before. It could have been growing up, but it could have been family of origin. It could have been with a previous relationship. I think there are also sometimes people avoid it because, is this going to end our relationship? If I bring this up, if we really get into this, if we deal with this, is somebody going to walk out the door? Is the marriage going to end? And of course, they don't want that. And so sometimes people don't say anything. And when that happens, it's like, well, you're cheating yourself out of what your marriage could be, for one thing,
Yeah.
instead of really just, okay, we've got to learn how to resolve conflict because it's going to
Mhm.
be there. And I think, the whole deal of conflict's always harmful. And then I think the deal of this desire to maintain peace at all costs. And I think, yes, we want peace in our homes,
Mhm.
but you can't get peace and ignore the things that need to be dealt with, because it's
Yeah.
really, it may be surface peace, but it's not deep down peace that
Yeah.
that I think which we desire in a marriage relationship.
Yeah, so it's almost a false peace because it's the absence of conflict, but it's not true peace.
Right. It's not, what is that absence of conflict? What do you replace that with? Well, the issue is still there. We're just not
Yeah.
talking about it because we want
Yeah.
peace. And
Mhm.
I can just, I don't know, I get my image in my head of just this kind of, everybody just kind of walks around like clones or
Mhm.
zombies. It's just like, well, we're here
Mhm.
together, and everybody's smiling like everything's okay, but
Yeah.
inside they're just not there.
Right. Yeah, cuz maybe one couple is kind of holding on to, they're kind of bearing the weight of all the things that they're not able to say. I mean, I've seen it happen too where it's like other people know the trigger point issues and they'll talk about it with other people, but not with the spouse. And if don't bring it up with my spouse, don't, no, I would never dare, because they know it'll cause conflict. And so then
Yeah.
there's this really weird disconnect where you almost have like this secret openness, but not openness with the spouse. It's very awkward, very,
Hmm.
very strange.
Yeah, and I was trying to think of some ways. How do we get into that? Okay, the Bible says, as a spouse, we serve each other, but serving each other to the extent of not dealing with issues, is that really serving? Serving involves a lot of things. It's certainly loving, doing things for the
Mhm.
person you care about, and being kind. But I think it's also making life better. And one of the things that makes life better is to learn to resolve conflict.
Yeah. 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 It's a growth point for sure. So, I mean, you mentioned something just a minute ago, but I'm wondering about when a couple avoids conflict. So they just kind of let things blow over when they disagree. What actually happens to that unaddressed conflict? Does it go away? Where does it go?
No, no, we were really good at that in the first few years of marriage. It was just like, we'd have a fight, and we had some pretty good fights. We'd both say things
Mhm.
we shouldn't have said, those kind of things.
Mhm.
And then I think after a couple of days of not talking to each other, we kind of missed each other. And so
Mhm.
then we'd kind of start talking and get back together, and, oh, everything's okay. And at that point, it's like, well, I don't want to bring it up now
Yeah.
because we're being nice to each other and it'll rock the boat, but it would come back up. And it, in one way or the other, the exact same thing, or the next thing came up, would be even more significant because we hadn't
Mhm.
resolved the thing in the
Mhm.
past. So I don't think it goes away. I think we have to address the things. And sometimes, maybe together as a couple, you say, that was such a stupid thing for us to fight over. Let's just learn from that and not fight over those anymore. Okay, you
Mhm.
dealt with it.
Mhm.
But maybe it's a big thing, and maybe it's something that does need to be dealt with and talked about. And so don't let it do that, because it's going to build up. It's going to lead to resentment, maybe even passive aggressive behavior. I've seen that. So all of a sudden you're upset. We couldn't resolve it, didn't resolve it, didn't talk about it. So it comes out in sideways. And then I think it just takes away at your emotional intimacy with each other. There's so many ways it can affect a marriage relationship. So yeah, that's why I would always say you just can't let it blow over, because it's going to come back some way.
Even if it's just this control. There's a certain sense of you need to control because we need to make sure that doesn't come up.
Yeah.
And you can't always do that. Sometimes things get brought up in ways you didn't expect it, whatever it is. You don't need to live with that fear of
Mm-mm.
something coming up. You need to know how to handle it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's such, and I think some people, because of past or what they've seen, they think, oh, we could never do that the right way. But you can. I
Right.
promise you can learn to do it
Right.
in a healthy way. And it will make such a difference in your marriage.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's unpack this process. So if a couple, they have no idea how to open a conversation, they know they're avoiding conflict and they just don't know where to start. Where can they start if they just have no idea and they're just scared it's going to come out wrong?
Yeah, I think for me, it's taking personal responsibility. I think is start it, not say,
Hmm.
"Hey, this conflict and you point the finger at your spouse. I think you've
Mm-hmm.
got to take your responsibility, because I think that sets a tone of that my spouse really wants to resolve this. They're taking
Mm-hmm.
responsibility for their part. And then I think it encourages your spouse to take responsibility for their part.
Mm-hmm.
Usually my experience has been in a conflict that both have contributed some way. It could be
Mm-hmm.
90-10, but in some way, both have been a part of it at that time. And so if you want to talk about, I mean, I think you do some of the basic things that we talk about. You find a time where you aren't interrupted, where we can sit down and talk. You say, and maybe you start that out with, hey, this happened, and this is what I did. I'm so sorry. Let's talk about it. Let's work through this so we can resolve this together. Using I statements,
Mm-hmm.
in a way that where you're not blaming the other person in any way.
Mm-hmm.
When you're saying, I know when I did this that it affected you this way. I saw it in the way you reacted or whatever, and I'm sorry I did that. Or
Mm-hmm.
just I statements. I think too, probably. I think it's always good to define what you want out of a conversation.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe on this, you're saying, hey, I really think we've been struggling with conflict resolution or avoiding conflict for a long
Mm-hmm.
time. I listened to this podcast or read a book or something that let me know how important it is that we learn to deal with conflict. And this just happened this week. I thought it'd be a great way for us to begin to learn that by just addressing that. Will you sit down
Mm-hmm.
with me and do that? And so you
Mm-hmm.
kind of frame the situation. And I would too, say you've got maybe there's 3 or 4 things you're thinking of that have built up. I would
Mm-hmm.
take the least contentious issue first,
Mm-hmm.
because you're trying to set a pattern of how do we resolve it. The pattern,
Mm-hmm.
the formula you come up with will work in other areas, but
Yeah.
start with something that it seems like this is more resolvable. I don't know if
Mm-hmm.
that's a word than the
Mm-hmm.
others would be. I think it's just so important to begin to have that conversation, and it
Mm-hmm.
may be a little awkward, but that's okay. If you framed it, you've said, "This is what I want. This is where I think it would be good for us to go with our marriage." Pray, God help
Mm-hmm.
us to do something well that we haven't done well in the past, and ask God to in the middle of it and just begin that conversation. And it's not going to resolve everything in that one conversation, but you've
Right.
made a start and you've kind of maybe had a game plan, and you can refine that as you go.
Yeah. Yeah. That's good. That's really good. And I think too, it's okay to use the I statement. I feel uncomfortable. I'm a little nervous. I don't want to bring
Yeah,
this up, but I would like for us to grow in this. Those are all also I statements that I think are really helpful rather than just kind of saying like, you need to do this better. I need to,
yeah,
we need to fix this. We're all, totally messed up. But just to kind of acknowledge that this is difficult, I think can be really humanizing and very
absolutely.
personal instead of making it like this homework assignment. It's just the two of you trying to grow together. And so just start
Hmm.
where you are, even if it's uncomfortable. It's okay to say that.
Yeah, because most of us have a tendency to blame our spouse and
Yeah.
things, and so anything
Hmm.
you can do, I statements is a great way to do that, to
Yeah.
own your own part in that, because that's the only thing you can do anything about anyway. You can
Yeah.
preach for 2 hours, and that's not going to change your spouse. What's going to
Don't
change your spouse
recommend
is them
that.
making the decision. Yeah, the decision to, oh yeah, my spouse wants things to be better. My spouse
Yeah.
wants us to learn to resolve conflict. I want to do that with them.
Hmm.
That's what you want. That's where you want to get.
Yeah. Yeah. So start simple, defining what you want out of the conversation. That was a really good tip. Two, start with prayer. I think one more thing might be to journal alone beforehand and just kind of get clear on what is it really.
Hmm.
You mentioned bringing up kind of the simplest thing first. And I think that might be hard to do if you're kind of got, some issues brewing that are difficult, but I think that kind of getting more self-aware before the conversation would be a help to the conversation. And one way to do that is journaling.
Yeah, and I think if you keep the mindset of we want this to be successful,
Yeah.
okay,
Yeah.
what are the ways to be successful? Maybe that issue is something we need to talk about tomorrow or the next day. Let's see if we can figure out this issue, and then we'll tackle that issue.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. You could do like a conflict snowball, like start with the easy one and then
There you
just
go.
work your way up.
There you go.
Good, good. Okay. So we kind of touched on some of this, but maybe there's a little bit more specific stuff. Do you have any advice for preparing for a successful conversation to bring some conflict resolution?
Yeah, one thing that I said you kind of just said, and that is reflect on what's going on within you, and your needs.
Mhm.
And I do, I believe in journaling. I think writing things down, it just helps us process and helps us clarify. And the more you do that ahead of time, I think the conversation goes better because you're
Mhm.
not having to process through things. You've already thought through some things. And I think too, being empathy is so important. Okay, taking
Mhm.
the time to say, what does this look like through my spouse's eyes?
Mhm.
What does this mean to them? How is this affecting them? What is their perspective in that? And as best you can, try to get there. Now, obviously, you may see some things different as you get into communication about it with your spouse, but you want to be willing to put yourself in your spouse's shoes.
Mhm.
It's important to do that. Every day, really. Just
Mhm.
the more what I've seen, the more I have empathy for Nancy and put myself in her shoes, the less conflict we have because
Mhm.
things don't bother me because I say, oh, yeah, she did have a rough day, or this happened, or that
Yeah.
happened, or, those kind of things.
Mm.
Makes my expectations of our relationship much more realistic than if I didn't do that. I think you want to know that part of that conversation is you're really going to listen to your spouse. If you find
Mhm.
yourself thinking about what you're going to say when your spouse stops talking, then you're not going to have a good conversation because you're going to
Mhm.
say something that has nothing to do with what they said because you want to make your point. It's kind of like watching some of the political debates. They never answer the
Oh
question.
gosh. Yeah,
They just,
right.
it's like they
Right.
say what they want to say. It doesn't matter what the question was,
That's
just
true.
give me the
Gosh,
mic,
so
turn my mic
frustrating.
on. Yeah.
So
And
frustrating.
so doing that and just being realistic about it, we're not going to solve everything now, but man, this is a good step for us learning how to handle conflict. And
Mhm.
that's what we want to do. That's our goal.
Yeah.
So I think those would be the things that really can help you prepare to really make this successful.
Yeah. That's good. And I think that's such a good point. I mean, just that you're saying preparation, because I don't know if we all assume that in a marriage you have to kind of like be this proactive. I think there's this really temptation and like desire to think that marriage conversation, communication should just happen and be easy and natural because you're in love and you've chosen to
Yep,
spend life together. And so I think just kind of reminding us that you do have to be intentional. We do have to be proactive. Like these things do take work. That's just helpful to baseline, but then also the work is really worth it. So you're describing a process of having a really productive conversation where you're going to be
right.
building this skill and growing together. So yeah, it's going to take some work. You're going to have to do some things differently than you've done before, but the payoff is really going to be worth it.
Absolutely. I was kind of thinking, when you're in school and there's a final exam, you study
Hmm.
for the exam. You
Yeah,
don't go
yeah.
in there unprepared. Because you want to keep a grade or you want to raise your
Hmm.
grade or those kind of things. Well, and sometimes just in marriage, we don't do the things that are necessary to make sure we have success in something. And
Right, right.
sometimes we think we know it all or we just wing it but taking time to pray, to prepare, to think through things are going to make a difference. And it's worth taking the time to do that. Like you said, Lindsay, the payoff is going to be really good.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so yeah, I think that's just a really important thing to point out that you're gonna have to have some, shifts in your mindset here, but it's worth having. So
Absolutely.
yeah. So moving on. So we're prepared for the conversation. We're gonna have this good conversation, but they finally get up the nerve. What's gonna sideline spouses during the actual conversation?
Well, I think you've got to stay on the topic because if you start
Mm.
bringing up the past,
Mm-hmm.
what I tell couples, if you start that and something else comes up, write it down
Mm-hmm.
and you'll deal with it later. You're not
Yeah.
going to deal with it this time. So I think that's
Yeah.
really important. If you don't listen, your spouse knows you're not listening. If you're interrupting your
Mm-hmm.
spouse, if you start getting back into the win lose thing as opposed to
Mm-hmm.
finding a solution, I think that is, if you don't compromise, there's
Mm-hmm.
going to always be compromise
Mm.
or should be, I think, because you're probably never going to get where you both agree 100% on something
Yeah.
like a topic like this. And so be willing to compromise about that. And I think too, if it's a really difficult topic and one of you starts getting too emotional, it's okay to say, let's take a time out and then let's come back and talk about it again. And so take
Mm-hmm.
that time to kind of calm down, to pray, to relax and come back again. And then I would start back with was there something I said that really hit you and that's why you began to cry, or because you kind of
Mhm.
shut down, and then go on from there, because you want to learn everything you can out about this.
Mhm.
And so learning those kind of things can be helpful. So those are the things that I would say. I think if you make a decision of something you're going to do, you definitely want to have a time to come back and see how you're doing on it, kind of a
Mhm.
progress report.
Mhm.
And so you want to maybe say, hey, let's try this a couple, or maybe you're doing the finance thing. And so you decide, okay, we're going to start doing this budget.
Mhm.
So every month on the 10th of the month, we're going to sit down together with this, see if our plan's working, and then readjust it if we need to.
Mhm.
And if you get stuck, if this isn't working, then go get professional help.
Yeah.
I mean, that's always available for you. And if you're stuck, just don't stay stuck, I guess is what I would say. Because I've seen couples do
Mhm.
that. I've seen couples come into counseling and I ask them how long they were stuck. And when they say 2 or 3 years, it's like, oh, wow, I wish you'd come in
Yeah.
earlier. So,
Yes. Yes.
yeah. And it's okay if you get stuck. Just
Mhm.
don't stay stuck is the main thing.
Yeah.
Talk to somebody.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. That's a great place, for them to know, like, yeah, you might run into some bumps. You might
Yeah, absolutely.
you might stall out a little bit, but don't stay there. Don't stay there.
Exactly. Because some
Yeah.
people do. And that's just, then you feel worse really than before. Oh my gosh, we
Mhm.
tried it and that didn't work. Now
Right.
we're really in a mess.
Right, right. I know. Yeah, and one then it's just going to take a little time too. Like any of these things we're working on, it's a total change of how you've handled things. So it is going to take some time. So the sooner the better.
Absolutely. And it doesn't take, if you've been married 20 years, it's not going to take 20 years
Gosh.
to turn it around. But it does, be patient, give it a little time, because you're building something you want for the future. So give it the time it needs
Yeah.
to deal with that.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yes. So okay, so we're on this, kind of process of the hard conversation they're having. They're getting sidelined, maybe they're bringing up past issues or whatever.
Hmm.
Any tips for what they can do when they kind of just get jammed up and stuck in the conversation?
Yeah, I do think you can take a short break, like we talked about. That certainly
Mhm.
can help. If you get off topic, refocus. Take that
Mhm.
time and give yourself permission ahead of time. So if I get off focus, Nancy knows that it's okay for her to say, "Hey, I think we're taking a rabbit trail, or we're getting off. We're brought
Mhm.
up another topic to get back on that." I think also agree on timeouts. Maybe it won't be a most, but maybe just it's like, "Oh my gosh, I need 10-minute timeout. I just
Mhm.
kind of clear my head a little bit." It's okay to do that as long as you come back. And then just, I think listening is such an important part of that,
Mhm.
of listening well to each other, making sure that I heard what Nancy said, making sure she heard what I said,
Mhm.
saying things in a way that we know the other person can hear. If I'm married to somebody that vocabulary is not a big deal for them and I start using words that they don't understand, just
Mhm.
why am I doing that?
Mhm. Mhm.
That's not good. So
Mhm.
just your goal is for your marriage to win, and anything that takes you off track, you want to get back on track.
Yeah,
So those are some
that's
things I
really
think you
good.
can do, yeah, when that happens.
That's really good, and that really does kind of point back to, like, if as long as you're trying to win or get one up or control, it's not a win for the marriage.
No, it's just not.
Mm-mm.
And you walk away thinking, "Ha ha, I won," and then you start thinking, "Well, if I win, then Nancy loses
Yeah,
first, and most likely
yeah,
my marriage is going to win. It's going to lose."
yeah, yeah,
So if your
yeah,
marriage wins, then all three of you can win.
yeah,
You, your
exactly.
marriage, and your spouse. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, that's good. So, okay, finally, so moving on, are there any tips you have to grow in the actual process of resolving the issue? Once they've identified it, they've had the conversation, they're kind of persevering through the difficult feelings that are kind of coming up, or maybe the temptation to bring up other things. What about actually resolving that issue?
But I think validation is something that's really important.
Mm.
When just an encouraging thing.
Hmm.
If I say something and it goes, "Oh, that really helped. That helped me see that," or I
Hmm.
say, "Oh yeah, now that you say it that way, yeah, I think I understand where you're coming from." Just anything you can to validate, to show empathy. Talked about compromise, how important that is. All of those things that are actually important in that process of resolving. And again, just the solutions. What are the solutions that you're going to come up with, and
Hmm.
making sure it's not a win-lose deal at that time.
Yeah.
Then again, if you go through all that and we're just still stuck, then get help. Go get help.
Hmm. Hmm.
Because I think sometimes, and I've seen couples that they go through it and they just get so frustrated and then they just kind of give up on it. And they almost sometimes couples decide, well, it's not going to change. We're just going to live this way.
Mhm.
Well, you're missing out. So
Yeah.
take the next
Yeah.
step. If you guys can't do it, get a professional to help you get back.
Mhm.
And I've had couples. I had a couple a few years ago, and it was just amazing. They were coming in just to basically for the first time, just to tell me that they tried everything. They're getting a divorce. I think that was my
Wow.
stamp of approval or something.
Wow.
But we started talking, got into some things, and they left, and they were so committed to each other. It was just like there were
Wow.
just some misunderstandings and communication,
Wow.
a lot of assumptions
Hmm.
about what the other person was thinking, not the sit down, let's talk about this kind of thing. And it was really fun to watch because you just saw their whole countenance change from the time they came in to
Wow.
the time they left. And that was a God deal for sure.
Mhm.
They just
Mhm.
needed somebody to help them see it from a different perspective, and then to give
Mhm.
them some guidelines and some things to do. And actually, we didn't really meet that much at
Mhm.
all. Once they got to that point, I gave them things to do, and they'd come in and check in every once in a while. But yeah, it was that was all they needed to do was get that part turned around. It was cool.
Wow. That's really cool. That's
Yeah.
amazing. And that's so much hope on the other side of this too, that there's so much you could clear up just by addressing things
Yes.
instead of making assumptions.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And if you don't ever check those out, then you believe those assumptions to be true.
Right.
They may
Right.
be the farthest thing in the world from being true.
Yeah. Yeah,
Now
that's
this
true.
this lady believed her husband didn't care at all about her because he just
Mm.
watched TV, and that
Mhm.
wasn't it. That wasn't it at all. He wanted to do
Wow.
things. He thought she didn't want to do anything with him.
Mhm.
I know we can get in some really interesting situations with our
Man.
humanness.
What a good testimony though, you know?
Yeah, absolutely.
And you got to do your goal of working yourself out of a job.
Yeah. Yes. Oh, yeah.
That's
That's
great.
always the goal.
That's great. That's great. So, okay, if a couple's listening today and they know they're not great at handling conflict, but they really just don't have it on their radar, are there any red flags that there is some unaddressed conflict that should be dealt with in your marriage?
Yeah, I think if you're seeing there's more tension, we're not, there's
Mhm.
tension in the relationship. Maybe I'm more irritable, Lindsay's irritable, something like that. I think sometimes we withdraw. That was something we did earlier in some of the earlier years of one of
Mhm.
us withdraw for whatever reason. Intimacy changes, whether that's sexual or just physical touch or just, communicating well to each
Mhm.
other, connecting, those kind of things. Passive aggressive behavior, it's coming out sideways. You're doing little things to irritate them without hitting head on what the problem is, and you just avoid each other. I guess that's
Mhm.
also kind of like the emotional distance, but it really is physically. Sometimes you just avoid doing things together. Usually you'd go
Mhm.
out to dinner together on Friday night, and you stop on your way home from work and pick up something to a drive through and come home and just sit at the table by yourself.
Mhm.
So I think just being aware is my marriage where it needs to be today? Are
Mhm.
we is there just a little sure times there's gonna be tension, sometimes we're gonna be irritable. But is that happening too much? Is that happening like
Mhm.
every day? How long has it been since we had intimacy in any form? So just kind of asking
Mhm.
yourself those questions. Okay, when did this start? Oh yeah, remember it did start after we had that fight and we never did resolve it. And that was really a pretty
Mhm.
bad fight. We both said some things we shouldn't and we just kind of let it hang there. Okay.
Mhm.
It's time to get serious about resolving it.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, those are really good. And I like too. I'm going to point back to something you mentioned earlier in the episode where you mentioned you and Nancy have a habit of keeping short accounts, which is
Yeah.
just a way of saying, if there's you just have kind of a policy of if there's something that was done that was hurtful, that you just go ahead and get it on the table instead of letting it linger. Is that how you would say that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's just, it's one of the things, and I think when we do the weekly checkup guide that we have for married couples,
Mhm.
that was something that we learned, we probably married 10 or 15 years, that someone suggested that. And so at that time, it was a really busy time in our life with the kids'
Mhm.
activities and everything. But we would take time in the middle of the afternoon on Sunday sometime to sit down and kind of go touch base about schedules and stuff. But one of the things we talked about, is there anything from this past week that we didn't take time to address that we need to address? That was
Mhm.
huge. And I
Mhm.
think it helped in a number of ways. I think one, it helped us resolve things, not let them build up. It also
Mhm.
helped in the busyness of a week. Something came up, and maybe we would have just said, "I just don't want to deal with it." That we could know, oh yeah, I can deal with that Sunday because we're going to sit down and talk, and I can deal with it then. And by Sunday,
Yeah.
you may have prayed about it, prayed through it, and decide it's not an issue anymore. Or you may
Mhm.
decide, I'm glad I jotted that down because I really still think we need to talk about that. So
Mhm.
having something built in to kind of be accountable with each other and accountable about what you're doing can be really helpful
Mhm.
too.
Yeah, that's so true. Yeah, and I think that kind of neutralizes the like it doesn't make it a big deal. It's just a normal thing, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. And if you never deal with conflict, then it is a big deal when you finally
Right.
do. It's
Right.
like, yeah. And
Yeah.
and you just I think too, being aware of things that we let build. So it may be a series
Mhm.
of things that seem small, but in the picture they weren't. Maybe they made you feel unappreciated.
Mhm.
And as they stood individually, it wasn't that big, but when you put
Mhm.
10 or 12 of them happening over a week, it's kind of like, okay, this is something we need to deal with and talk about. Yes,
Yeah.
individually, that wasn't a big deal. This
Mhm.
pattern is what's really
Mhm.
something we need to talk about.
Yeah. That's so good. Yeah. Well, Dr. Kim, you've given a lot of great advice today in this conversation. Do you have any final piece of advice for our listeners today?
And yeah, one of my favorite things is when I see couples figure out how to have conflict in a healthy way. Because I
Mhm.
know that once they get it, they may not always use it, but they know how to do it. And that's
Mhm.
such a gift, like I've said before, to give your marriage. And so wherever you are with conflict, if you feel like you're avoiding it, I'm
Mhm.
not dealing with it well, I would just encourage you to take that first step. Use some of the ideas we've talked about today. Maybe make that appointment with a counselor or whatever it is. Or maybe it's you listen to this and you think, I need to talk to my spouse about this. And so maybe you
Mhm.
ask yourself, hey, will you listen to this with me again? Because I think there's some things that can help us. Maybe you should share some things from the podcast or your spouse listens
Mhm.
to it. And then you begin to say, okay, let's have that first meeting. Let's set that time to sit down, talk this through. What do you want to do? See if we can get on top of this and learn to resolve conflict in a healthy way. Are you ready to do that with me? And
Mhm.
I hope your spouse says yes.
Yeah, I hope so. I hope so. And yeah, you can just start with listening. Just take the first thing that you think of that sounds like it would work for you, try it, and then keep trying.
Yeah,
It's
that's
going to
right.
be it's going to be worth it.
Absolutely.
And if you're wanting to build into your marriage, I want to make sure you know about our marriage multiplier weekly email. It's a quick email straight from Dr. Kim with just really helpful tips and intentional ways to build your marriage. And this email is awesome too because it deals with a lot of different topics within marriage. So it'll do conflict resolution, intimacy, emotional connection. I mean, just anything you can think of, finances, whatever. It could be anything, but there's just a quick little practical tips and steps that you can take each week just to make sure you're continuing to be intentional about building into your marriage, being proactive, doing those little things that matter to strengthen your marriage. And I think this is just such a great resource we have because it's very, very practical and simple. So you can sign up for that in the link in today's show notes or at awesomemarriage.com because really our goal is to help you grow your marriage. And that does not happen without intentionality. So make sure to check out that link in today's show notes. The other links to things we've mentioned will be in the show notes as well. And if there's anything that you need from us, don't hesitate to reach out. We'd love to hear from you, answer questions, pray for you. You can email us at info@awesomemarriage.com. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks so much again for joining us today on the Awesome Marriage Podcast. Have a great day and do something awesome for your marriage today.